Picture this. It's a freezing cold November night in 1930. The wind howls like a hungry wolf across the vast, frozen landscape of northern Canada. You're a lonely trapper, tough as nails, and you stumble upon a sight that will chill you to your very soul. An entire village, thousands of people, an entire community, just gone. Not a struggle, not a body, just an absolute, terrifying silence. What happened to the Inuit people of Anjikuni Lake? Was it a mass migration, a forgotten sickness, or something much, much darker? For nearly a century, this mystery has baffled investigators and haunted the imagination. It's the story of the vanishing village, and once you hear the details, you'll never look at the empty wilderness the same way again. Stay with me, because we're about to walk into the silence of Anjikuni. It was November 20th, 1930. Joe Labelle was a man who knew the cold. He was a seasoned fur trapper, French-Canadian by birth, and the kind of guy who could read the wilderness like a newspaper. He'd been trapping up and down the Northwest Territories for years, a solitary existence punctuated only by the occasional trip to a trading post. That night, he was making his way toward Anjikuni Lake, a remote body of water in what is now Nunavut. He knew there was a large Inuit village nearby. He'd traded with them before, and they were always welcoming. Joe had a couple of good pelts he was hoping to swap for supplies, and maybe a hot meal and some company. It was a brutal trip, even by his standards. The temperature had dropped well below zero, and the biting wind felt like needles in his skin. As he got closer to the village, Joe expected to see the familiar plume of smoke rising from the community fires. He expected to hear the faint sound of dogs barking, or maybe the murmur of people talking. But there was nothing. Just a heavy, unnatural silence that seemed to swallow the sound of his own footsteps in the snow. He told himself maybe they were sleeping, or perhaps they were just being quiet. But as he crested the last ridge and the village came into full view, a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. The village was there. The igloos and sod houses were all standing, perfectly intact. But there was no movement, no light, no life. Joe was cautious. He unslinged his rifle and approached the first dwelling. He called out, first in English, then in a mix of Inuktitut and broken French he'd picked up over the years. "Hello? Is anyone here?" The only answer was the whisper of the wind. He pushed aside the hide covering of the doorway and stepped inside. It was shocking. The fire pit was cold, but everything else was in place. Cooking pots, tools, clothes. It was as if the inhabitants had simply walked away in the middle of a chore. A half-eaten meal sat on a stone slab. It looked like they had literally been interrupted during dinner. This was the first detail that truly unnerved him. Inuit people, especially in the deep winter, never abandoned their supplies. Their survival depended on planning and preparation. To leave a meal and valuable tools behind was unthinkable. Joe checked house after house, his heart pounding harder with every empty dwelling. He started to count. There were houses, huts, and structures that suggested a population of at least 1,000, perhaps more. Not the 7,000 often reported later, but certainly a huge community for the Arctic. He found one house where a needle and thread were still sitting on a piece of unfinished embroidery. In another, a hunting rifle was propped against the wall, but all the valuable ammunition was still in its box. No seasoned hunter would ever leave a rifle and ammo behind. As the sheer scale of the abandonment sank in, a cold sweat broke out on his brow, colder than the air itself. This wasn't a temporary move. This felt like a simultaneous, instant, and utter vanishing. Joe Labelle was now standing in a ghost town, and the feeling that he was not alone, but merely moments behind whatever had happened, was absolutely terrifying. He knew he had to get help, but the nearest mounted police post was hundreds of miles away. Joe Labelle, gripped by a fear he'd never known, didn't stick around long after realizing the village was truly empty. He had to report what he'd found, but the sheer distance to the nearest human outpost meant he'd be traveling for days. Before he left, however, he forced himself to do a quick, more systematic search, driven by a need to understand what could have happened. It was during this secondary sweep that he made the most disturbing discoveries, the things that cemented the Anjikuni mystery into the realm of the truly inexplicable. The first was the caches of food. Across the Arctic, food is life. Every family would have winter storage, and these caches would be meticulously guarded. Yet, Joe found several large stores of dried fish and seal meat that had been ripped open, not neatly accessed, but violently torn apart, as if by an animal, a very large, very powerful animal. But there were no footprints around the caches that looked like a bear or a wolf. More importantly, the dogs were missing. In a village of that size, there should have been dozens, maybe even over 100 sled dogs. These dogs were the lifeblood of the community, essential for travel and hunting. But every single dog was gone. No tracks leading away, no signs of struggle, and no bodies. Joe knew sled dogs. If they were starving, they would howl. If they had been let loose, they would have likely returned to the village, or their tracks would be everywhere. Their complete disappearance, along with the humans, was the second massive piece of the puzzle that made no sense. It was as if every living creature had been scooped up simultaneously. The third, and perhaps most gruesome, discovery involved the local burial ground. Out of pure instinct and a growing suspicion that something terrible had happened, Joe ventured to the small hillside used for interments. What he found there was an act of desecration that defied belief. Several graves had been disturbed. The stone markers were scattered, and the bodies had been removed. This wasn't the work of grave robbers. The people of Anjikuni didn't have valuables worth stealing in this manner. It was a violation of the most sacred space, done with a strange, clinical thoroughness. What's more, the bodies that had been removed were laid back down, but outside the graves, neatly stacked, and then recovered with a thin layer of snow. It was a chillingly organized act that had no clear motive, and it suggested a presence that was intelligent, yet utterly alien to human sensibilities. As Joe stood there, staring at the empty, silent village and the disturbed graves, the wind seemed to pick up a strange, mournful sound, a high-pitched hum that wasn't quite natural. He didn't wait to investigate that sound. The reality of the situation was too much. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a phenomenon. The scale of the vanishing, the intact homes, the uneaten food, the missing dogs, and the disturbed dead, it all pointed to something beyond normal human understanding. He turned his back on Anjikuni and started his long, desperate trek to the nearest Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, outpost in the small settlement of Churchill, hundreds of miles to the southeast, carrying a story he knew no one would truly believe. It took Joe Labelle several grueling days to reach the nearest telegraph office and relay his story. The trapper was a credible source. He was well known and respected, not the type to invent tall tales. His report reached the RCMP detachment in Churchill, Manitoba, where Corporal John Fitzgerald was on duty. Fitzgerald, a seasoned officer who'd seen his share of strange things in the north, initially chalked it up to mass migration or perhaps a fast-spreading, deadly illness. But the details about the uneaten food and the missing dogs gave him pause. He assembled a small team and, within a day, they were heading toward Anjikuni Lake by dog sled, following the rough, but accurate, directions Joe had provided. The journey was long and arduous. By the time Fitzgerald and his team arrived at Anjikuni, nearly a week had passed since Joe Labelle's discovery. As they approached, the same terrifying silence that had greeted the trapper fell over them. The village was exactly as Labelle had described, intact, eerily quiet, and utterly abandoned. Corporal Fitzgerald later wrote in his official report that the scene was like a movie set where the actors had vanished mid-scene. The RCMP team went methodically through the dwellings. They confirmed all of Joe's findings: the still-standing pots over cold fire pits, the half-mended clothes, and the ample supply caches. The incredible level of preservation, the fact that the village looked ready for its occupants to return any minute, was overwhelming evidence against a simple migration. People taking a long journey in the winter take their tools, their food, and their best furs. None of that was missing. They found no signs of violence, no blood, and no footprints in the light dusting of snow other than Labelle's and their own. Fitzgerald also made a critical discovery that Joe had missed: a strange, iridescent blue light, barely perceptible, that seemed to pulse faintly from the windows of the largest community structure. When he and another officer, Constable Davis, investigated it, the light vanished, but they both confirmed seeing it. They dismissed it as an atmospheric anomaly or maybe a trick of the sub-zero air, but the memory stayed with them. The most baffling element for Fitzgerald was, like Labelle, the missing dogs. He was an experienced tracker and spent a full day searching the surrounding area for any trace of the village's sled dogs. Finally, miles away from the village center, he found them. The bodies of several dozen sled dogs were uncovered, buried under a deep, hard-packed snowdrift. They had been deliberately killed and buried. This was not the work of wolves or starvation. The tracks indicated they had been pulled into the snow bank and then frozen solid. The manner of their death and burial was highly unusual and suggested a conscious, organized effort to neutralize the village's only means of swift, large-scale transport. The dog's death only deepened the mystery. Why kill and bury the animals if you're not going to kill the people, and why leave everything else behind? The RCMP officers spent days conducting a thorough search, but the only conclusion they could reach was the same as Joe Labelle's. Every human being from the village of Anjikuni Lake had simply, inexplicably, vanished. The case was officially logged as a missing persons case of unprecedented scale, and a dark shadow was cast over the vast, empty north. Corporal Fitzgerald's official report on the vanishing village of Anjikuni Lake was a document of cautious bewilderment. He meticulously detailed the physical evidence: the intact homes, the abandoned supplies, the half-cooked meals, and the unnerving discovery of the deceased sled dogs. The report was sent up the chain of command within the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, eventually landing on the desks of administrators in Ottawa. Initially, many high-ranking officials were highly skeptical. The idea of an entire village disappearing without a single clue or sign of struggle felt like something out of folklore, not a credible police investigation. The first theory presented by the skeptics was simple: a planned, rapid migration. The elders might have decided, due to poor hunting or changing weather patterns, to move the entire community to a new location. They might have simply been in too much of a hurry to gather all their belongings. This theory, however, quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Joe Labelle and Corporal Fitzgerald both noted that the village was packed with supplies essential for survival that no Inuit community would ever leave behind, especially in the harsh cold of November. Furthermore, a migration of thousands of people would leave an unmistakable trail of footprints, sled marks, and discarded items, even if covered by light snow. Fitzgerald's team had spent days tracking and found nothing of the sort leading away from the village. Another prevailing and grimier theory was a devastating, swift-acting epidemic. Perhaps a highly contagious and lethal flu or other disease wiped out the population so quickly that no one had time to react or bury the dead. But this theory had two massive holes in it. First, the bodies were missing. Even the fastest-acting disease would leave behind thousands of corpses. The village was completely empty of human remains. Second, there was no sign of sickness in the dwellings. No hastily abandoned medicines, no sickbeds, and no vomit or blood. The houses were clean and tidy, simply abandoned. The press, however, caught wind of the story, thanks to a leak from the Churchill detachment. While the official reports were kept quiet, rumors began to spread like wildfire across Canada and the United States. Sensational headlines screamed about the Arctic ghost town and the 7,000 vanishing souls, immediately exaggerating the population count and adding lurid details, such as glowing lights and alien interventions. While the RCMP officially downplayed the incident, the narrative of the Anjikuni mystery was already taking shape in the public imagination, transforming from a police report into a full-blown legend. Fitzgerald was ordered to return to the site in the spring, once the snow had thawed, for a more thorough forensic investigation. But even he knew deep down that the answer wasn't going to be found in tracks or footprints. The sheer, terrifying completeness of the vanishing defied every rational explanation they could muster. As the story of Anjikuni grew in infamy, other trappers and inhabitants of the remote Canadian North began to come forward with their own unsettling tales. These accounts, gathered and recorded unofficially by various journalists and amateur investigators who flocked north, began to weave a disturbing pattern suggesting that the vanishing was not just a one-off event, but perhaps the culmination of something strange that had been happening for some time in the region. The most consistent and highly unusual reports centered around strange lights in the sky near Anjikuni Lake. Several trappers, including a man named Alexei who often worked near the Kazan River, claimed to have seen large, glowing, cylindrical objects moving silently through the night sky in the months leading up to November 1930. These weren't meteors or the aurora borealis, which they were all familiar with. Alexei described one object as being huge, like a giant red cigar, hovering low over the horizon before shooting straight up into the atmosphere without a sound. He swore he'd told the people of Anjikuni about it, and they had seemed deeply disturbed, talking about old legends of sky spirits. Another set of witnesses, two prospectors returning from a claim near Baker Lake, reported something even more bizarre. They claimed that, about 2 days before Joe Labelle arrived, they saw a smoky, shimmering blue pillar of light hovering directly over the area of Anjikuni Lake. They said the light didn't move or cast shadows. It just stood there, pulsing with an inner luminosity. They were frightened and kept their distance, assuming it was some natural but frightening atmospheric phenomenon. When they learned later about the vanishing, they immediately connected the two events, suggesting that whatever that light was, it was directly involved in the removal of the people. These witness accounts were largely dismissed by the official RCMP investigation, which focused strictly on physical evidence and standard police procedures. They argued that these men were isolated, potentially unreliable, or simply misinterpreting common Arctic phenomena like the Northern Lights. However, the sheer number of similar accounts over a vast geographical area made it difficult to ignore completely. The reports of unusual aerial phenomena were not just limited to the days immediately surrounding the vanishing. There were accounts stretching back years of strange lights and movements in the sky over the remote territories. It raised a chilling question. Had the people of Anjikuni been living under observation for a long time? And did whatever was in the sky finally decide to intervene? For the locals, these stories weren't just rumors. They were old, ancestral fears given terrifying, modern reality. To truly understand the fear that descended upon the Canadian North after the Anjikuni vanishing, one had to look beyond official reports and into the rich, oral history of the Inuit people themselves. Long before the white trappers and prospectors arrived, the people of the North had legends, and many of these legends suddenly took on a sinister new meaning in the wake of the mass disappearance. Local elders and those from neighboring communities, when cautiously interviewed by those few who gained their trust, spoke of a chilling, recurring legend, the Kalupilluit. While the traditional Kalupilluit are sea creatures who snatch children who wander too close to the water, the version tied to the interior lakes like Anjikuni was different. This version spoke of beings that came not from the sea, but from the high mountains or the sky, creatures that harvested souls or people in times of extreme cold. They were often described as silent, tall shadows accompanied by the sound of a deep, sorrowful hum and flashes of blue and red light. More relevant still was the legend of the Adlet. While sometimes described as monstrous part human, part dog creatures, another interpretation referred to them as the others, beings who lived outside the known world, capable of great speed and of making things disappear. The legend warned that when the Adlet decided to move, they could take entire camps without a whisper, leaving only perfect, unnerving silence behind. The key detail in this legend was the silence. In the Arctic, silence is death. The world should always be making noise, wind, animals, dogs. The absolute, profound quiet Joe Labelle encountered was the perfect match for the ancient warnings. The most disturbing connection, however, came from the community's ancestral ties to the burial grounds. The local Inuit believed in respecting the dead above all else. The removal of the bodies from the graves, as observed by Labelle and the RCMP, was an act of profound spiritual violation. The elders viewed this as a clear sign that the agency behind the vanishing was not human and did not abide by human rules of life and death. The legends spoke of certain spirits who sought not to harm the living, but to collect them, sometimes for reasons unfathomable to mankind. The disturbed graves suggested a physical, organized removal, a harvesting of bodies, both living and dead. This interpretation added a layer of cosmic horror to the case. It wasn't just murder or migration. It was an intersection with something primordial and terrifying. For the native people of the region, the vanishing wasn't a mystery. It was the fulfillment of an ancient, terrifying prophecy whispered on the bitter Arctic wind. These legends, dismissed by outsiders as mere superstition, offered the only framework that could possibly contain the sheer impossibility of the Anjikuni Lake incident. When spring finally arrived in the Arctic, Corporal Fitzgerald and a larger RCMP team returned to Anjikuni Lake. The spring thaw was supposed to reveal the crucial evidence that the deep November snow had hidden: footprints, discarded belongings, or, tragically, bodies. However, the warmer weather only served to deepen the mystery, offering contradictory and unsettling clues rather than solutions. The first major discovery was the nets and kayaks. Along the shoreline, where the ice was receding, they found several fishing nets that had been carefully stored for the winter. These were vital tools for survival. More perplexing were the kayaks, or kajak. Several of these skin boats, which were painstakingly crafted and highly valuable, were still in the village, near the shoreline. If the community had suddenly migrated, they would have taken every single means of transport. To leave behind several kayaks was like leaving behind your only car in a remote town. It suggested they didn't need them where they were going, or that the exit was so sudden there was no time to prepare them. The thorough forensic sweep that Fitzgerald had hoped for revealed almost nothing conclusive. The ground, now free of snow, showed no signs of a mass movement of people. There was no widespread disturbance of the tundra, no indication that thousands of feet had marched away. This was the strongest evidence yet against the migration theory. The Earth itself bore witness to the fact that the people had simply ceased to be there. However, the team did find several small, unusual depressions in the earth near the main community house, perfectly circular indentations, about 6 feet in diameter, that looked like something large and heavy had briefly rested there. They were too symmetrical to be natural formations, and too shallow to be old post holes. The RCMP tried to dismiss them as collapsed snow pits, but they felt distinctly unnatural. They took soil samples, but the tests revealed nothing extraordinary, just typical tundra dirt. They also noted that the ground around the disturbed graves was strangely compacted, almost hardened, as if subjected to intense pressure or heat. The spring thaw, instead of washing away the mystery, only highlighted the sheer impossibility of the event. The evidence suggested a large, rapid removal, but provided absolutely zero information about who, or what, was responsible for it. The conclusion was the same. The people had vanished, and the environment offered no standard human explanation for their departure. As the official investigation stalled and the RCMP reluctantly admitted they had no concrete leads, the media took over. The vanishing village of Anjikuni was no longer a regional police case. It became an international phenomenon. Newspapers in Toronto, New York, and London ran daily updates, often fabricating details to keep the story alive. The population number swelled from a reasonable estimate of 1,000 to the sensational and often repeated 7,000 souls, a number that truly captured the imagination and amplified the scale of the tragedy. The public reaction was a mixture of fascination and deep unease. In a time when the world was already unstable, just recovering from the Great War and entering the Great Depression, the idea of a massive, inexplicable disappearance struck a nerve. It fed into the latent fears of the unknown wilderness and the sense that the world was larger and more terrifying than modern society liked to admit. The media coverage often focused on two main theories, completely ignoring the pragmatic concerns of the RCMP: alien abduction and supernatural forces. The UFO theory gained traction thanks to the earlier reports of the cylindrical and cigar-shaped objects. It was argued that a highly advanced extraterrestrial race had chosen the remote, unpopulated Arctic as a staging ground for a mass collection of humans for study. The intact homes and abandoned supplies were interpreted as proof of a rapid, high-tech removal. No time to pack, no sign of struggle, just a silent beam of light. The supernatural angle was fueled by the local legends and the unsettling detail of the disturbed graves. Commentators, often writers specializing in the occult, suggested a rift in reality, a momentary tear in the veil between worlds, allowing an entity to sweep the entire population into another dimension. The disturbed graves were seen as evidence that whatever took the living also felt compelled to complete its collection by taking the dead. This public discourse created significant fear, especially in smaller, isolated northern communities. Trappers, miners, and missionaries began refusing to travel alone, and the very mention of Anjikuni Lake became taboo, a whispered warning against wandering too far from civilization. The story became a cultural touchstone, cementing itself as one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. While the legend of the vanishing village was solidifying in the public mind, a few dog journalists and historians began to chip away at the facts, uncovering significant discrepancies that called the entire sensational narrative into question. The primary issue was the population count. No credible census data from the 1920s or 1930s supported the claim of 7,000 residents at Anjikuni Lake. Historically, the largest permanent Inuit settlements were much smaller. Anjikuni was, at best, a seasonal hunting camp that occasionally swelled to a few hundred people, not a large city. While the disappearance of even 500 people is a massive tragedy, the number 7,000 was a journalistic exaggeration that sensationalized the event. Furthermore, the role of Joe Labelle was slightly re-examined. While he was a known trapper, early versions of the story were often inconsistent about the exact dates he visited the village, and some local archives suggested his initial report to the RCMP may have been several days after he claimed. Some skeptics even suggested that Labelle had simply stumbled upon an already abandoned seasonal camp and then, either intentionally or through misremembering, added the more dramatic details like the half-eaten meals and the strange silence to spice up his tale. However, the most forceful argument against the vanishing came from the RCMP's own records over time. Later reports, decades after the initial frenzy, subtly began to distance the force from the more sensational claims. It was noted that, while Corporal Fitzgerald confirmed an empty camp, the details regarding the blue light and the disturbed graves became less prominent, almost disappearing from subsequent, less publicized internal documents. Some historians believe that while an abandonment certainly occurred, perhaps due to famine or a localized catastrophe that drove the community away quickly, the more outlandish elements of the story were either embellished by the panicked trapper or accidentally exaggerated by the police in the chaos of a remote investigation. Despite the logical critiques, the core facts remained stubbornly unresolved. A large group of people did abandon their essential winter provisions. The dogs did vanish or were found buried in a bizarre manner. The village was completely empty. Even if the numbers were smaller and the details slightly skewed, the fundamental mystery, where did the people of Anjikuni go, and why did they leave everything behind, still defied a conventional answer. The skeptic's hammer could dent the legend, but it could not shatter the chilling core of the vanishing. Decades passed, and the case of the vanishing village of Anjikuni officially went cold, but its grip on the public imagination never faded. In the late 1960s and 1970s, as interest in UFOs and paranormal phenomena surged, a new wave of amateur investigators, journalists, and paranormal researchers started digging into the old RCMP records and interviewing the descendants of the original witnesses. These modern sleuths brought new perspectives and, crucially, new technologies, though the outcome remained the same: no definitive answer. One of the most persistent investigators was a writer named Frank Graves. He spent years tracking down retired RCMP officers, including some who had worked with Corporal Fitzgerald. Graves was keen to revisit the most unusual details of the original report: the strange blue light and the disturbed graves, details that had been increasingly marginalized in official accounts over time. Graves managed to interview an elderly Constable Davis, who confirmed the strange, faint, iridescent blue light seen pulsing inside the main village structure. Davis confessed that at the time, they were ordered to downplay this observation, fearing they would be ridiculed. This interview added weight to the idea that something truly inexplicable had occurred, something the authorities were uncomfortable admitting. Graves also examined the geological samples taken during the spring thaw of 1931. While the original tests showed nothing unusual, Graves suggested that the circular depressions and the hardened earth around the graves could be interpreted as vitrification, a process where intense, localized heat fuses the soil into a glass-like substance. This kind of energy signature is sometimes associated with meteorite impacts or, in the realm of conjecture, propulsion systems from highly advanced craft. Although this was pure speculation, it provided a dramatic, physical link between the site and the UFO sightings reported by the trappers. The modern investigators struggled against a major obstacle: the lack of physical proof and the contamination of the site over the years. By the time they arrived, decades after the fact, any subtle clues like residual radiation or trace material would have long since dispersed or been covered by the harsh Arctic weather. Nonetheless, their efforts were significant because they systematically documented the contradictions in the official story, forcing the focus back onto the high strangeness of the initial discovery, rather than the skeptical, rationalized explanations that followed. The cold case remained cold, but the bizarre facts at its heart were now undeniable again. As the Anjikuni story gained worldwide attention, people began drawing parallels between the vanishing village and other infamous cases of mass disappearance or ghost towns around the world. These comparisons helped situate Anjikuni not as an isolated incident, but as part of a terrifying, recurring pattern of inexplicable human absence. One key parallel was the famous case of the Mary Celeste, the sailing ship found completely abandoned in 1872 with its cargo intact and no sign of struggle, often referred to as a ghost ship. The similarity lies in the immediate, nonviolent abandonment of essential items. Just as the crew of the Mary Celeste left behind their possessions, personal effects, and a half-eaten meal, the people of Anjikuni left behind their food, tools, and weapons. In both cases, the scene suggests an interruption so sudden and compelling that the inhabitants dropped everything and vanished. Another, more unsettling parallel was the concept of spontaneous collective disappearance found in various cultures' urban legends. While these were mostly fiction, the sheer scale of the Anjikuni vanishing made it a terrifying real-life example. It fueled theories of coordinated human removal, perhaps as part of a secret military experiment or a mass psychological event. For example, some theorized a form of infrasound, a low-frequency sound wave that is unheard by the human ear but can cause extreme anxiety, disorientation, and an overwhelming compulsion to flee. If a highly localized source of infrasound was used, it might explain why the people left so suddenly and collectively, though it wouldn't explain the missing bodies or the disturbed graves. The search for parallels ultimately only amplified the unique terror of Anjikuni. In nearly every other historical ghost town or disappearance, a clear cause could eventually be identified: famine, economic collapse, war, or specific mass murder. Anjikuni Lake stands alone because of the completeness of the absence and the abundance of the supplies left behind. It was a perfect contradiction. Comparing it to others only highlighted the chilling fact that whatever happened at Anjikuni was perhaps the purest and most pristine example of an entire community instantly and utterly ceasing to exist. The lasting legacy of the vanishing village of Anjikuni Lake is a complex web spun from genuine terror, journalistic recklessness, and official reticence. Over the ensuing decades, the facts became so intertwined with fiction that it's almost impossible to separate them. The original story has been repeated and embellished so many times that the mystery has become self-sustaining, a powerful urban legend of the frozen north. One of the most destructive aspects of the legacy is the misinformation, specifically the grossly inflated number of 7,000 people. This number was so often cited in books, documentaries, and news articles that it became a foundational fact of the story. The sheer scale implied by this figure makes the mystery feel uniquely powerful and unsolvable, whereas the disappearance of a few hundred people, while tragic, might be explained by a localized, severe famine or tragedy that simply wasn't reported. The other major piece of the legacy is the shadow it cast on the RCMP. The force's perceived failure to solve the case, coupled with their later attempts to minimize the strange details like the blue light and the graves, led to decades of speculation about a cover-up. Many believe the Mounties knew more than they let on and either participated in a government effort to hide an unknown military experiment or a genuine extraterrestrial encounter. Whether true or not, this perception fueled decades of distrust among conspiracy enthusiasts and even some local residents. Ultimately, the true legacy of Anjikuni lies not in its official resolution, because there isn't one, but in its role as a cultural nightmare. It serves as a reminder of the vast, untamed power of the Canadian wilderness and the idea that humanity, even in large numbers, can be erased in an instant without a trace. It is the perfect ghost story, passed down by word of mouth and sensationalized by the media, ensuring that the silence of that remote November night in 1930 continues to echo across the decades, forever asking, where did they go? To fully appreciate the tragedy of Anjikuni, one must stop looking through the lens of Western forensics and listen to the cultural context of the people who vanished. The Inuit communities of the region offered a perspective that transcended the simple question of where the people went, focusing instead on why they were taken. For the local people, the explanation lay firmly in the spiritual realm, tied directly to the health of the community and its relationship with the land and the sky. The Inuit belief system holds that the world is populated by powerful spirits, or Inua, that reside in everything: the animals, the weather, and even the air itself. These spirits are generally respected and appeased through proper actions and rituals. However, there were warnings about a type of celestial Inua, often described as glowing, silent entities, that would only intervene in human affairs if the cosmic balance was severely upset, usually by a failure to respect the hunt or a profound spiritual malaise within a community. When elders from neighboring communities spoke about Anjikuni, they didn't talk about aliens or criminals, they spoke about imbalance. Some suggested that the Anjikuni community had grown too large, relying too much on trade with outsiders, like Joe Labelle, and had begun to neglect the old ways. This spiritual weakness, they believed, made them vulnerable. The Inuit of the sky, seeing this imbalance and perhaps viewing the community as a disruption to the pure, untamed nature of the land, simply removed the problem. The fact that the entire village was taken, leaving no survivors, suggested an act of complete divine judgment, or, at least, complete spiritual intervention. This perspective perfectly explained the strange details that baffled the RCMP. The intact belongings were left because the removal was not about theft or poverty, it was about the people. The disturbing of the graves was viewed as the spirit's way of ensuring that the entire ancestral line was collected, leaving no remnant of the corrupted community on the land. In this spiritual framework, the lack of struggle or trace evidence wasn't a failure of policing. It was a demonstration of overwhelming, effortless power. For many who truly understood the North, the vanishing of Anjikuni was a terrifying, real-world confirmation that the old gods still held ultimate dominion over the barren, beautiful, and unforgiving Arctic landscape. In the years following World War II, the UFO phenomenon exploded, and the Anjikuni Lake case was firmly adopted by ufologists. This was largely due to the consistent, early reports of the strange, cylindrical, glowing objects seen by trappers before and after the disappearance. As official government agencies in Canada and the United States began to secretly track and investigate unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, the Anjikuni incident was sometimes referenced internally, not as a proven case, but as a historical data point of mass disappearance tied to unusual aerial sightings. The theory most often floated by ufologists was that Anjikuni was the first recorded instance of mass human harvesting. The intact structures suggested a non-destructive method of removal, a technology that could selectively dematerialize or lift the organic material, the people and the dogs, while leaving inorganic supplies and buildings untouched. The small, circular ground depressions found during the spring thaw were interpreted as landing gear marks, and the blue light seen by Corporal Fitzgerald was the residual energy signature of a warp or transport system. While the RCMP firmly closed the case as missing, presumed dead, cause unknown, records later showed that Canadian military intelligence briefly considered the possibility of a Soviet or unknown foreign power using advanced, highly classified aerial technology for an espionage or testing exercise. This was quickly dismissed, as there was no strategic value in removing an isolated Inuit community. However, the very fact that powerful government entities even briefly entertained non-standard explanations shows how truly baffling the evidence at Anjikuni was. The case remains a cornerstone in UAP folklore, serving as a bleak historical precedent that suggests some non-human presence is capable of intervening in human life on a massive, organized scale, leaving nothing but an impossible vacuum behind. The lake itself, surrounded by so much mystery and fear, continues to pull attention, a silent monument to a day when an entire community was erased. 95 years later, the silence of Anjikuni Lake is as profound and impenetrable as it was on that cold November night in 1930. The village is long gone, reclaimed by the harsh Arctic weather and the ever-encroaching tundra. The sod houses have crumbled, the trails have vanished, and only the geological contours of the land remain to mark the spot where thousands of lives once thrived. Yet, the story persists, a testament to the power of an absolute, unsolved mystery. The lack of a definitive, rational conclusion is precisely what gives the Anjikuni case its enduring power. It challenges the fundamental human need for order and explanation. Every possible conventional explanation, migration, disease, murder, or even a bear attack, is immediately contradicted by the physical evidence. The abandoned supplies, the missing bodies, the buried dogs, and the utter lack of a struggle. The only remaining theories are those that stretch the boundaries of reality. The ancient spiritual collection, the swift, silent intervention of an unknown intelligence, or a momentary tear in the fabric of existence. Ultimately, the vanishing village of Anjikuni is a story not just about a disappearance, but about the human confrontation with the unknown. It forces us to acknowledge that there are forces, whether natural, spiritual, or technological, operating in the world that are vastly beyond our current understanding. The tragedy of the people of Anjikuni, stripped of their identity and their final resting place, is compounded by the endless speculation that surrounds their fate. We may never know if they were taken by sky spirits, collected by aliens, or simply the victims of a natural event so bizarre it defied detection. What we do know is that on a cold, quiet night in the Canadian North, an entire village ceased to exist, leaving behind only the chilling, absolute, and unending silence of Anjikuni Lake. The story of the vanishing village of Anjikuni is more than just a historical account. It's a terrifying look into the sheer, cold unknown. Imagine walking into that village, seeing the half-eaten food, the clothes laid out, the rifle waiting for its owner, and realizing you are standing in a place where life simply stopped instantaneously. No tracks, no bodies, just a horrifying, perfect silence. If an entire community can be erased from the face of the earth without a trace, what does that say about the security of our own existence? It leaves you with the haunting question. If 1,000 people can disappear so completely, what stops it from happening again? Let me know what you think happened in the comments below. UFOs, a spiritual curse, or something completely different? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more deep dive mysteries, and share this story with someone who loves a good, unsolved puzzle. Until next time, stay safe, and always watch your back in the deep quiet of the world.